December 25th, 2017, Christmas time. The BBC is airing its annual Doctor Who Christmas special, this time coinciding with the ending of the 12th iteration of the titular character, played at the time by actor Peter Capaldi, and the final one to be penned by head writer Stephen Moffat, who, after 7 years at the helm through the 7th iteration's run played by Matt Smith, had decided to leave the series alongside Capaldi. To many fans, this seemed like the end of a monumental era for the franchise, as Moffat had been head since the previous head writer Russell T Davies left the helm after 5 years following David Tennant's departure as the 10th Doctor in 2009. And with his era ending, much like the beginning of the Moffat era previously, there was a lot of anxieties over if Doctor Who could survive without one of the writers who penned amazing works, and over time lesser amazing works, over the course of nearly a decade. So when the reveal came that the new 13th iteration would not only be played by Jodie Whittaker, the first actress to ever play the role of the Doctor, but the new head writer for the series would be penned by Chris Chibnall, many people had some very fluctuating responses to this, to say the least. And those fluctuating responses continued over time, as for the next 4 years the consensus would go from
"This show is alright, not as good as Capaldi or Tennant,"
to
God, why is this series becoming so dull and drab?
to
This show is so fucking woke now! Doctor Who is dead forever!
But I think with the 14th Doctor specials in the rearview mirror, and with 15th time currently ongoing as of this video's air date, I think it's about time we try and take a deeper look at the good within the bad of such a polarizingly unlucky iteration of Britain's greatest export. It's time to re-evaluate the 13th Doctor. Now, as per usual, there's going to be a lot of things that I'm not going to be able to defend across what we're talking about here today. So, in no particular order, let's talk about the stuff I am not going to be able to defend in one way or another throughout this. Number 1, Chris Chibnall as a head writer. The big thing a lot of people feel is one of the bigger issues surrounding the 13th Doctor's time in the spotlight has no doubt been the issues surrounding the writing of this time, and how it can all mainly be traced back to Chibnall as the head writer for this series. And trust me, I am not going to be defending Chibnall as a head writer, because while we did get some amazing moments from his time as head writer in charge, the ratio of amazing moments to absolutely carny writing is 1-4 the entire run. Let me put it to you all like this. For as much as we rag on Moffat and even RTD from time to time, we can still confidently say that they had a good start, and the decline started after a little while in, right? Well, imagine there wasn't a steep decline in the writing, and the bar for good writing was in hell about halfway through the first season. And while there are some moments for reference I think are genuinely amazing, some of which are a bit controversial, but we'll get there when we get there, I feel like the criticisms of Chibnall making 13 seem a bit un-Doctor-like and very much out of character, while also having some of the most clunkiest, preachiest bits of dialogue ever put to the screen for Whovians to enjoy, is one thing I cannot and will not defend. Number 2, Jack Harkness, why are you here? This may not really come off as a big thing for many people during this run, but trust me when I say I have a bone to pick with the fact that this man is still around after all this time. And not even just because this actor is slowly turning into a genuine POS in real life, but also from a narrative perspective. And for those of you who are wondering why, spoilers ahead for Torchwood Children of Earth, but after Jack is not only revealed to have been the reason behind the children having been given to the 456 previously, and using his own grandchild as a means to an end to kill said being, he leaves Earth of his own accord and is implied to not be returning or involving himself in any affairs any longer. So why in the fuck is he suddenly involving himself in the Doctor's life again after swearing off all involvement with this kind of thing? Does he randomly show up in Fusion of the to just be there and hint at the series finale's whole thing? And then he's back in Revolution of the Dogs because why the fuck not, I guess? I'm sorry, but every time he shows up in the 13th Doctor series, it feels less like a fun little cameo and more like they're propping up his corpse Weekend at Bernie style for no reason other than to get a mild reaction out of the fans. And before anybody asks me, Chloe, what about Torchwood Miracle Day? He comes back in that, right? All I have to say is this. Miracle Day isn't canon, especially with that ending of all things. This is one of the few things that may have been fine to others, but personally, I just feel like it was one of the few things I could not stand in an iteration that, by all accounts, could have done better things with it. The other one being the Yaz 13 queerbaiting. This one is probably not going to earn me any favors, but let's just say that this is here because I, like many others, felt that this was a tacked-on experience to Yaz's character, which, by all accounts, was arguably fine without it. The weird addition to have Yaz slowly fall in love with 13 over the course of the series run, and have it be yet another companion who falls in love with the Doctor storyline, which arguably had grown tired by Smith's era. Wait, did I say slowly fall in love with? I meant to say, they just started writing she had feelings for them during Flux and the subsequent specials before their regeneration, and it came right the hell out of nowhere because there was no signs of it beforehand. I do, however, feel very much like the whole companions falling in love with the Doctor thing is a very big thing that needs to be abolished, and one of my hopes with RTD's second run is that we don't get that again with Ruby and 15. But who can say, really? I just know that Yaz falling in love with 13 was one of the worst bits for either of their characters, not the least bit believable, and honestly, if it was Chibnall's attempt at queer representation, then honey, save it for the guy who gave us Jack and Ianto, and it's a sin. Enough said. Number 4, destroying Gallifrey again! This one really got many a Whovian upset when it was revealed, and to this day I am still very angered by this for many reasons. But the most important ones I feel worth mentioning are the fact that this basically nullifies the entire point behind Day of the Doctor, with the return of Gallifrey from the pocket dimension they were placed in during the events being something we were excited to see happen. It makes the events of Heaven Sent and Hellbent basically a waste of time, because why even have the Time Lords back to hang over the Doctor's head if they're just dead now again because the Master went on a rampage and killed them all? And especially this one, it just resets the Doctor back to how they were back at the beginning of New Who all over again. They are once more the last of the Time Lords, and I really feel like Chibnall really wanted to make that nickname stick for some reason, because it was good for marketing or something like that. Not only that, but they basically salted the earth on Gallifrey as well by saying that all living things in it are dead, and there's absolutely no way of bringing it back this time. But this is Doctor Who. We know that they'll find a way to bring it back somehow, especially with RTD at the helm. It's just the carelessness of it, the lack of reason behind it, and really the lack of impact behind this happening. Like, Gallifrey being destroyed again by the Master should have been something that was shown on screen to show something big and important when it's of this magnitude. With how it was treated here, Gallifrey felt more like an afterthought more than anything. And that's just depressing to think about, given its history in the lore of Doctor Who. And finally, number 5, Orphan 55, and other subsequent awful episodes. This one's gonna be quick. Episodes like Orphan 55, Ragsor of Kolos, and the Suranaga Complex are not going to be defended as concepts. The absolute worst of this series definitely deserves the hate that they get, and I cringed watching it then as much as I do now. And for those wondering why a certain episode wasn't a part of that list, we'll get to it eventually. But for now, let's get to the points prior, starting with... Let's start off by talking about the first big thing that a lot of people seem to think is a bigger problem with this run of the Doctor themselves. And just to get this out of the way, none of what I am going to say is anything bad related to Whittaker as an actress. She is amazing, and I personally feel like if she was given marginally better scripts than what was presented in this, there would be significantly less complaints from the masses. But seeing as we're working with what we're given, let's look at why I think her portrayal of the Time Lord isn't as bad as what people seem to think. First off, I want to talk about the way she's portrayed all throughout this. Some people lobbying the idea that Whittaker's run as a Doctor is all over the place and doesn't feel much like the Doctor that came before her run. Some people even saying she feels out of character given the last few iterations and the past decade and a half of stories that were told. And I actually want to try and debunk that idea, because while it may be out of character compared to the other iterations told from Eccleston to Capaldi before her, I honestly feel that this is an iteration of the Doctor who is trying for the first time to remove themselves from the trauma of the Time War and the constant machinations of her Time Lord kin. Mind you, with that above statement, they still find themselves being subjugated to the plans of not only the arguable best iteration of the Master in the modern era, but also several other new additions to the Time Lord canon which we will touch upon later on in this look through. So it doesn't exactly work out for them well in the hopes of that being a thing that they can escape from long term. But in the first season and first half of the second season especially, it does feel like 13 is a lot more loose, I guess is the right way of saying it, feeling at times like she's a pastiche of more wackier iterations before them, like Tennant and Smith before her, except without the trauma of the Time War to have it be seen as some kind of coping mechanism. I think that's also something that can be applied to Whittaker, if only because of how 13 manages to use it to hide their pain, is the same reason why she clings tightly to her fab, and it's arguably later expanded upon with the later 14 specials. The Doctor is tired by this point. Between the trauma and reliving parts of the Time War, losing companions in increasingly traumatic ways, and dealing with your past lives' trauma as well, it's kind of hard not to think that at some point you kind of just decide that you don't want to do this alone and you just want something peaceful. Again, something I feel like the 14 specials last year handled a lot better, but you can kind of see that puzzle emerge from 13's run, especially given the fact that she did end up having to deal with fallout from the events of From Gallifrey returning, finding it destroyed again, and then having to deal with her own past being hidden from her, and then a cosmic threat that basically wiped out half the galaxy. This is to say that I think people see 13's character as being a bit all over the place as being a sign that Chibnall had no idea how to write the Doctor, which is a valid point for Chibnall. But I want to argue that her character being all over the place is honestly very much in character for the Doctor at this point of time. And it's the only logical place you could go from Capaldi's classic Who style with New Who brooding, and the bridge to 14 and 15's talk about how they just never stopped despite everything. Yes, I will say that 13 can be a bit overbearing at times, and her manner of speaking at times can be a bit head-scratching. But it's not like their predecessors did do something similar when it came time for their runs. End of the day, nobody is free from the sins of bad writing, but when it comes to characterization, with the context of what we have now in front of us, I think 13 deserves to be seen as the final step towards the Doctor realizing that they need to slow down and take time to process things, instead of just continuing to run away from it all. Because 13 couldn't do that at the end, and it took most of the recent iteration to tell themselves, we can't keep doing this. Finally. In essence, 13 is messy as an iteration of the character of the Doctor. Yes, I will agree with that. But I don't think it makes her a bad iteration per se. I even feel like it works in the favor of where the story would go for the Doctor following on her run. But that's only one core of the issues that the viewers who watch the series had with it. The other three being... Believe it or not, this iteration of the Doctor is the first time since Peter Davidson's run in the 80s that the Doctor had 3 permanent companions within the TARDIS. While this was experimented on a bit with having 2 companions in Amy and Rory in Season 6 and the first half of Season 7, this was something of a change for the modern era to have 3 at one time. And once this got up and running, a lot of people said they remembered why they hadn't seen it happen in so long. So, Graham, Ryan, and Yaz, also known as the Fam, constantly by 13, are the main group that follows along with her for the majority of their run, and are, for better or for worse, one of the main things that make this run of Doctor Who so unique, but also such a sore spot for some folks. Couldn't tell you why some of them aren't a fan of it, though. I will definitely say before we get into the parts about why I think this does work, however, I do get the critiques on the individual character arcs suffering as a result of the characters being split 4 ways between the Doctor and the 3 companions themselves. I do also get the fact that by the end Yaz becomes more the focus at the expense of the other 2 as well. I also think that is not the best way of handling Yaz as a character because it made her focus less on her own family and the dynamics surrounding that and more, oh, she's queer now! Now that my gripes of these 3 are out of the way, let's talk about what I feel makes them work well alongside Whittaker and the TARDIS. So, Graham and Ryan's relationship is very amazing as a concept for companions, having a grieving son and a recently widowed father on board for the ride, as they try to make sense of their relationship without the mother, while also dealing with the whole grief about a family member dying while on crazy space adventures with this odd lady that they found one day. And what I feel makes it strike a bit harder as one of the more important bits of the first series of 13 is the fact that Grace, Graham's wife, and Ryan's mother dies in the very first episode of the series run for 13. And while I feel there could have definitely been some moments past Arachnids in the UK where they do dwell on this a bit more, with it only coming back up sporadically and suddenly coming back for closure in Revolution of the Daleks, which is also Graham and Ryan's departure episode. As individual companions, however, I feel they do kind of suffer a bit outside of when their development does get pushed to the side a bit in the latter half of their run. But that doesn't exactly mean that they're entirely wasted as companions. Hell, I'd argue 2 of Graham's shining moments come from the 3rd episode of their run, Rosa, in which Graham is the person who is meant to deny Rosa Parks her seat and ensure history happens in the way it's meant to be, which works doubly so because of him being reminded of Grace while this is happening, and literally begging it to be anyone but him. Despite all the better treatment he had been getting up until that point due to the period of time in which they are in, he's still very much in a state of crisis throughout this. This also ties into a second moment I'll mention of Graham during this season as well in It Takes You Away, which while it was a dull episode all things considered, I can't lie, every time I see Graham go to save Ryan and rejecting the apparition of Grace, despite how their relationship is still on the rocky ground during this time, it makes me so bloody happy when it happens. And by comparison, Ryan has some amazing moments with 13 by the end of his time in the TARDIS, with his highlights especially coming from the second season where, while it has clunky writing sure, it does show that Ryan as a solo character is worth a damn, especially given that a lot of personal development may come from others, but he himself is a damn good character at his core. Yaz though, well, you know how you can tell in most multi-companion teams which one of them is favored but not most by how they're written by the end? You could definitely tell Yaz was the favorite of Chibnall in this same regard. This isn't to say Yaz isn't liked by me, far from it. I think Yaz is actually the strongest written companion of this tenure despite how comparatively she's in the background for a fair chunk of her time. But it's when she comes more into her own as she has more time with the Doctor does it become clear that she's seen as her second for this run, something of which is made clear by Revolution. It was intended to be a sign for her to stick around longer than the other two. Granted, by the end of their time together, even discounting in relationship stuff between the two, Yaz becomes very much a huge snarker towards 13, which is a bit unfair given the fact 13 is having a bit of a time of her own, and is not exactly used to people trying to pry about their past, especially when they themselves are having a fucking time about it. But I still think that their dynamic is one of the ones I feel the most conflicted on, because on one hand, I really love it when the Doctor doesn't have a perfect relationship with their companions, and it means you get to do moments like when Yaz is being a snarky git in Flux, and basically throughout most of the final stretch for Whittaker. But also, like I said before, I'm not a fan of the queer baiting between these two, and I am so tired of Doctor-companion relationships, and while this wasn't the straw that broke the camel's back with me on it, I very much feel like it's one of those things that makes me think negatively on Yaz. Well, that, and she's a cop, and, well, a cab. Really though, I think a lot of people don't like this set of companions because, well, when you line them up with 13, you can kind of hear the screaming terminally aligned people in the distance claiming how woke this series is when you try and think about why they're criticized so much. I get it. I get it isn't the main reason why, though. I just feel I need to point it out after all the talk of the denser stuff surrounding the companions this time around. I get also why people don't want free companion setups because of situations like this where it becomes obvious that you gotta sacrifice one of them to favor the others. Hence why it went down from 3 to 1 by the end of 13's tenure. But I honestly want to see them tackle this dynamic again. You know, with a better head writer at the helm. With that being said though, now that we've tackled the immediate ones, let's get to talking about some of the deeper-seated and more controversial topics of this run, starting with arguably the most controversial one of them all. This is the one I feel like will get most people arguing in the comments section about. But after 4 years of trying to decipher this, and having enough time to try and see the bigger picture of it, and even having RTD come out and say that he's taking that and Flux into account for this second era of Who of his, that the timeless child isn't that bad of a concept to introduce. But when it came out in 2020, holy shit, did this end up becoming a hot button topic amongst Whovians, to the point where if you even mention the two words, you're probably still bound to attract the worst kinds of fans of this era, and it's somehow still being debated and talked about to this day. And honestly, while I think the initial shock of it was very much something that did give a lot of pause to those who have been following it for quite some time, I don't think it's necessarily a character-ruining retcon that so many people online really have it set up to be as. In fact, I'm one of the ones that would argue this is something that has been, in one way or another, slightly hinted at for 4 decades at this point in canon. As this idea has been hinted back as far as the brain of Morbius during Tom Baker's time as the 4th Doctor, with the idea being that the iterations we saw on the globe were in fact pre-Hartnell incarnations of the Doctor, with the fugitive Doctor introduced during this iteration being of a similar nature. But Chloe, I hear you cry, the Doctor being a special and suddenly having this lore to make them the progenitor behind all Time Lords is bullshit! And it still ruins the character and everything about them previously! Why aren't you mad about that? 2 words. Cartmel Master Plan. For those uninitiated, the Cartmel Master Plan was an attempt during Sylvester McCoy's run as the 7th Doctor to essentially reveal the Doctor as actually being an incarnation of the being known as the Other, who was to be revealed as one of the founders of Time Lord Society, establishing the regenerative cycles and even establishing time travel for them. There were many hints throughout this time during McCoy's dialogue that hinted towards this, especially during those with their time with Ace, usually surrounding other familiarities of Time Lords such as the Hand of Omega, or mentioning how he's
far more than just another Time Lord.
To Davros in Remembrance of the Daleks, indicating that there was more than meets the eye for them. And it's even further hinted at during this time with the likes of the knowledge presented for the Nemesis statue in Silver Nemesis, indicating that there was more to his history and his life than anyone knew, and Fenric's ultimate fate and Curse of Fenric making it clear that there was more to the Doctor's power than they let on. A lot of other stuff in the expanded Doctor Who universe through the new adventure novels via version books, in particular the story Lungbarrow, which is meant to be the crux of the entire story, does have a lot of dubiousness in canon due to the interesting levels of what is acceptable and what isn't when being compared to into the official BBC canon, which includes stuff like the Big Finish audio dramas into the mix. It's still worth bringing up all of this in my opinion because this is far from the first time that such a lore-shattering thing has happened to the Doctor. And yes, I am fully aware that citing this is ironic given that Cartmel himself has gone on record to state that he is critical of the timeless child idea. But personally speaking, I feel we're all allowed to be hypocrites sometimes in our lives. My argument here is simple. If such things could be accepted in the time of 7 and accepted as things that are in fact remembered fondly, why is it so different when it's used in Modern Who when nearly every iteration of Modern Who has had some amazing ass pull of their own by this point? Do we even need to talk about Ten's clap your hands if you believe regeneration back to normal? There's always been an idea of there being more to the Doctor, and I feel exploring that and bringing that more to the forefront after decades of leaving bits and bobs at the side to theorize about is a very good thing. And with the fact that RTD is essentially set to ensure that this does get adjusted into canon, we may very well see it looked at in potentially better way than what we could have gotten from Chibnall in my opinion. Alongside one other piece from this era I feel needs better judgment on. Doctor Who and serialized seasons really can't catch a break, can they? Between this, Trial of a Time Lord, and I guess Key to Time if you count that as a serialized season, it feels like any time a story is made to be the entire plot of one entire season of the show, it's arguably the worst of that Doctor's run, or it's one of the more contentious seasons, period. But for the sake of today's comparison, let's use Trial of a Time Lord as its comparison point, especially because its legacy for Colin Baker's 6th Doctor is the easiest to compare it to overall, with it being the final proper season of both iterations of the Doctor as well as being one that was done at the last minute due to 2 separate crises that affected production. Now, only problem I really have with Flux is personally the issue with the fact that it only has 6 episodes to tell a complex story like what they were trying to do with Flux. And in all honesty, it kind of suffers the most from that fact that compared to other seasons before it, it's pretty much a half-length season even by Chibnall era standards, with only having 10 episodes and the Moffat RTD era having 12. Outside of that, however, it's arguably the most ambitious thing this run chose to do outside of the timeless child reveal for its second season finale. One thing which I feel if given more time to flesh out proper with all the bits and bobs it was trying to get done, could have easily been one of the grander statements of Whittaker's run. But with what we've got, it's not too bad. We get Dan in there. Everyone loves Dan, yeah? Or is it just the memes? Seriously speaking here, however, the re-emergence of Unit during this storyline was great, especially given how it foreshadowed their later involvement in the Centenary specials to follow, as well as future installments to come. And honestly, it was great to see Kate Stewart during this time as well, as she'd become a constant since Moffat's era, and considering it was Chibnall who wrote her first episode during that time, it only makes sense he'd portray her as the other badass she is leading the resistance against the Sontaran invasion of Earth during this time. Plus, it is arguably the best invocation of bits and bobs from Zagreus I've probably ever seen in any New Who-related media, and from that alone, I feel it deserves some damn good praise. But arguably, I just love the fact that this story felt like Chibnall and company were trying their best with the hand that they were dealt. It's not perfect, far from it, but with how it panned out in the end, I feel like it could have been leagues away worse than what we got in the end. It actually managed to give us some pretty decent villains in the Vanquishers, as well as a new status quo for the universe to look into, some of which is currently being explored in one way or another in RTD's second run. But that's just separate parts to one whole. What about the complete package? The thing is, I feel like many people assume it's that while 13's run may have not been the best, they assume because of that it's arguably the worst series run in the entirety of Doctor Who, period. And while I certainly won't be debating that in the case of New Who, I'd honestly say it has some competition for that one if we're talking about the collective runs of Colin Baker and, dare I say it, John Pertwee. That last one is a personal one, by the way, please do not attack me over it. But when your run as Doctor has Sasha Dewan of Worst Witch spin-off Weird Sister College playing arguably one of the better incarnations of the Master and the Spy Master during this time, with his highlights including one of the better reveals as him being the Master, as well as the scene where he confuses a Dalek and a Cyber Lord he's working with by dancing to Rasputin, you know it's not all that bad. Yes, there is a lot of flawed writing, unbearable stories being told, and arguably some of the hardest moments to handle and sit back and think to yourself, do I really want to keep watching this during it? But I will definitely say that when it gets good and shows that it does have some level of promise in it, it could do amazing work. Its first season was clunky as hell, but I'd argue that The Woman Who Fell to Earth and The Ghost Monument are a wonderful opening pair that showed this series had potential. Rosa falling after it made me happy for the return of historicals to the lineup, alongside Demons of the Punjab after that. Minus some clunky writing in the latter bringing it down a bit. Kerplam felt the series could have its cake and eat it with talking about unfortunately very real exploitation of workers in warehouse big businesses like Space Amazon. I mean, Kerplam ends up being, and it made me yearn for more episodes like it that took a different approach to how stories with the Doctor are told. The Spyfall two-parter was arguably such a fun romp, even discounting the debut of the Spy Master, and it felt like something I had expected Doctor Who to do by that point. Try and pastiche something like James Bond, because why the hell not at this point? It was genuinely fun, and it led up to such a big overarching story throughout the second season of 13, one of which picked up further in Fugitive of the Jejune, in which we get an added mystery I hope they delve into more over time. The Fugitive Doctor, and the many, many past lives we've yet to encounter due to the Timeless Child reveal. And yes, Ascension of the Cybermen and Timeless Children. I love the former, and I've grown to appreciate the latter to a degree that I feel both work well as companion pieces. The former is arguably one of the best modern master plots and Cybermen stories next to the finale of Capaldi, and the latter I feel will look back on one day, not fondly on, but more appreciative of it over time. And the specials after Flux, especially The Power of the Doctor, felt like such a wonderful send-off to Whittaker. Not too self-indulgent in its own right, didn't feel too sudden, didn't feel too overly long, and honestly, was the right kind of regeneration story, and moment in particular I can get behind. End of the day, Whittaker may not be anyone's favorite Doctor anytime soon, and may not be the best Doctor of New Who, but I feel like her run deserves to be looked at with less disgust and anger, but maybe for a sense of fondness that we've come to find ourselves towards Colin Baker's run as the Sixth Doctor. Maybe Big Finish Audios can potentially help with that. Maybe some future stories that could help weave her run a bit easier with the future. I just don't want Whittaker's run to be seen as the run that almost killed Doctor Who again, because it did far from that. It may have been annoying at the worst, boring most of the time, but when it was good, to quote Whittaker herself, it was bloody brilliant. And really, what more does Doctor Who have to be at its best than being bloody brilliant when it can be?